Okay, thank you for joining me. My name is Julian Bollitter. I'm from the Australian Urban Design Research Centre in Perth. We're a research centre focused on the big issues facing cities. And today I'm going to present a lecture entitled Greenspace Oriented Development as part of the Fundamentals of Planning unit. So thanks for joining me. Okay, so this presentation really is about a new dream for Australian cities called Greenspace Oriented Development, which proposes that people could live in densified urban catchments around upgraded parks, which act as wonderful communal backyards for people living around them at a higher density. The presentation will be in three parts. The first part, we will take a very quick look at some of the problems of perpetuating a sprawling city model in this 21st century. Conventionally, planners have responded to the issues of sprawl, which have been well known for a decade or two at least, with trying to achieve infill development or urban consolidation. We'll also look at some of the problems that this can experience and cause, particularly in the middle ring suburbs. Finally, we'll look at the potential of green space oriented development, which is a new way of looking at densification in Australian cities. So the Australian dream has offered us many wonderful amenities and advantages. It allows people to recreate in private, in nature, to grow their own food, to deal with household wastes on site, to recreate in nature in private, to have pets, to have hobbies. Perfect for kids, perfect for adults. And in many respects, it's delivered the wonderful amenity that Australian cities are well known for, and livability. However, it arguably is starting to run out of steam for a number of reasons. First and foremost, sprawled city models often can cause massive issues for biodiversity or peri-urban biodiversity on the fringe of the city. Here we can see in the inset map here a map of the world's biodiversity hotspots. They're considered to be the life support systems of the planet. They're in green. So the biodiversity is concentrated in these green hotspots. The little pink dots are cities, and the size of the pink dot is relative to the city's projected growth. So the story of urban design in the century would be partly how do you manage the growth of that pink dot of the city with the biodiversity hotspot. We have a problem in southwest of Australia, which is called the Southwest Australia Biodiversity Hotspot, in that we've already cleared 93% of that biodiversity hotspot, partly for agricultural development, but also for suburban development. And it's not easy to reconcile the two. And we can see here, this is what's actually been left of those endemic plant associations by 2019. And part of this is due to suburban development, such as we can see on the inset image on the left. Between 2001 and 2010, we were destroying something like 841 hectares of biodiversity on the fringe of our city, of the city of Perth every year. So it's very hard to reconcile these two models, partly because the suburban development patterns that occur in Perth typically erase the kind of environmental structure of those sites by virtue of the fact that they require so much sandfill to be built up above the level of waterlogging in winter. But there are many other issues that a sprawling city model perpetuates. Now, I won't go into them all in detail here, but suffice to say, as you push into a biodiversity hotspot, as you push into biodiverse areas on the city fringes, you often cause a situation where you're creating outer suburbs which are really vulnerable to bushfires, which is no surprise. We have the extinction of biodiversity in some places. But it's also about things like it can be really difficult to service outer suburbs with public transport. It's very difficult to decentralise jobs, particularly the well-paying knowledge economy jobs from city centres to the fringe. And that can often, the combination of those two things can often mean there's a real punishing commute for workers living on the fringe who are either stuck in traffic or relying on intermittent and long-distance public transport commutes. At the same time, we do find that Australian cities are becoming increasingly less egalitarian. There's an increasing stratification between those who can afford to live in the inner and middle ring suburbs and have access to well-paying knowledge economy jobs, and those who are stuck on the fringe. And so we have relative kind of socio-deprivation occurring on the fringe. The other thing is the sprawling city model beyond being a threat to ecology, is often also perpetuating and compounding basic raw material shortages. Often the suburban development model is quite thirsty for water, and in cities like Perth, we actually have over-exceeded our groundwater allocation for some new suburban developments. So what that means is we don't really know how we'll irrigate public open space in some fringe areas, other than using a desalination, which has its own issues. The result of, I guess, some of these issues that outer suburban residents confront is that we find that the level of psychological distress in some outer suburbs is really high. It can be around 10 or 11 people out of 100 who are experiencing psychological distress. So they're all kind of mental health issues which go with that, and physical health issues. So while the suburban dream has really provided us, I think, wonderful livability and amenity over at least a century in Australia, it is starting to run out of steam for these reasons. So look, it's been a favourite pastime of planners to slag off sprawl for near on 2 decades. But what they tend to propose as a kind of solution also has its own issues. So really what has been held up as a solution to the problems of sprawl has been urban consolidation, otherwise known as urban infill. Here we can see a map. It's showing in the orange dots what are called activity centres. So these are areas of urban density where within the existing city where infill development or urban consolidation is meant to occur. The black dots, which you can just see, this kind of confetti of black dots, is actually where infill development is happening. So we're finding there's a lot of really dispersed ad hoc infill development going on in backyards throughout cities like Perth, often nowhere near public transport, which is where the activity centres are generally located. And so this is causing a whole series of other issues. So I'll take you for a bit of a tour of infill development patterns in Perth, which is fairly typical of other Australian cities, particularly Melbourne and Brisbane. So we can see here again the black dots of urban consolidation occurring, which is more or less subdivision of backyards. And we find that a lot of it is not near where regional open space is. Now that's really important because regional open space is where we get our most pure expression of nature in the city. And there's a lot of literature which suggests as people move to a higher density, they generally want to have more experience of nature, which can compensate for not having a backyard in which you can sort of recreate in private in nature. So these public open spaces become more important. But where a lot of the density is happening, it's not really very near any regional open space. The other thing is, infill development is typically much better served by what's called public open space, which is more your local kind of parks, like you can see here. But the problem is the infill development typically hasn't occurred in a way which has really upgraded those spaces to be the kind of communal backyards that are needed for people who are living in high density settings. And when we look at data around these kind of these generic sort of parks, we find that 90% of them in Perth have no significant wildlife function. 74% are really just reticulated turf, like you can see here. 54% have no walking paths, and 22% have no trees. This is data from the Centre of Built Environment and Health, EWA. So this is a real worry. These parks are not really designed to meet the needs of the residents living around them, not really giving much of an experience of nature. At the same time, urban infill development, such as we can see here in the black dots, is typically causing an erosion of urban forest canopy cover. When we look at areas like Belmont here, we find that they might only have 5% or even less urban canopy cover and a lot of background infill. And that's because as the background infill is occurring, typically it's destroying a lot of the urban forest. Up to about 60% of urban forests occur in back gardens and private land. And when the density happens, we often see a reduction in mature tree canopy cover, such as we can see in these visualizations here. And urban forests are not just the trimmings, they are vital for urban livability. They help to mitigate extreme heat events, mitigate urban heat island. They provide habitat for biodiversity. They help to infiltrate stormwater into the aquifer. And they provide mental and physical health benefits just by the virtue of looking at a tree that might form part of an urban forest. So when background infill has this kind of effect on the urban forest, we should be worried. And indeed, communities are. Communities are often regarded as being NIMBYs, which stands for not in my backyard. But actually, there's a better acronym which really sums up the public sullenness around infill development in many Australian cities. called bananas, which stand for build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything. So it's always easy as an academic to sit back and throw darts at things and dismantle sprawl and dismantle infill and business as usual model. But it's a bit harder to come up with an alternative model for how we could go about doing things. But we've had a go at this. And apologies to Ebenezer Howard here, who came up with a wonderful 3 magnets diagram regarding the garden cities, which was his brainchild. His idea was to bring together the best elements of town, which looked at things like social opportunity and economic opportunity, and melded with the best things about the country, which was the beauty of nature. And you bring them together in town country, which was the garden cities. So we've bastardised this diagram, and we have looked to really combine what are the aspirations of transit-oriented development, which is the idea of density around public transport nodes, with the leafy green access to nature of suburbia. We tried to bring them in together in what we call GOD, which is Greenspace Oriented Development. So the idea of Greenspace Oriented Development is essentially this. What you do as the Australian state government's trying to do with density around public transport, what you're really trying to do is get a synergy between public transport and high density living, which is the idea that people won't need cars because they'll all be commuting to work on trains. And also that by concentrating people around public transit nodes, you'll get more employment opportunities actually appearing in those nodes. It's been a real battle though, but that synergy of public transport use, employment potential and residential densification all make sense. It's been very hard to deliver though in practice. So what we're proposing here is that people could live in densified urban form, such as you can see on the left, around upgraded parks, which offer all kinds of benefits to people living around them. They include improved physical health, improved mental health, improved social cohesion, biodiversity conservation, noise reduction, carbon sequestration, local climate regulation, air purification, and water purification and infiltration. So there's all these kind of what are called ecosystem services, which nature offers these people living around it. Like I was saying before, you are healthier for looking into nature because the body relaxes. We're not designed to live in cities. The full sweep of our evolutionary history has not occurred in cities. It's been ostensibly in what you could call nature. Cities have been a fairly recent evolution. There's no wonder we find them stressful and difficult in some cases. So there's a real synergy here between the upgraded park and the densified urban form. On the other hand, the densified urban form offers a number of things back to the upgraded park. You get passive surveillance of the park, which is people looking at it and making sure it's safe because it's well observed and well overlooked. You get capital for park maintenance, so the idea that you can actually increase rates that people are paying in areas around the parks to pay for maintenance. You get the community involved in the park and they can be part of actively maintaining the park. They activate the park, they bring life to it. And you can look at third pipe solutions where grey water from washing machines and the like can be directed back to the park for irrigation. And you can also collect nutrients from communal compost, fertiliser. So we originally called it synergistic density because there are so many synergies between densified urban form and an upgraded park. And this is what these sort of parks look like now, typically a product of the recreation movement, more or less about ball sports surrounded by low density suburban form. This is a kind of byproduct of mid-20th century recreation movement planning. And then the idea of Greenspace Oriented Development, keeping some ovals, but actually trying to deliver a park that does more things for more people, more of the time. It's a much greener space, it gives better access to nature, and it's about actually just really trying to diversify what parks can offer people, both in recreational, ecological, and social terms. The inset image you can see on the bottom right there, that map, just shows the little black dots of possible train stations, a kind of 15-minute walk or 20-minute walk, and then the major parks around those train stations with density, shown in orange there, occurring around the park. So it's really about trying to bring together the transit-oriented development, connectivity to transit, but also the wonderful landscape amenity, suburban living expressed in a park. An image before of these parks, typically a product of the recreation movement, large kind of turf deserts with a scattering of mature trees. This is probably a little bit harsh. And then the idea of God, which is people living around it in high density, much more wildlife and environmental function. We can see a wetland there, we can see lots of mature trees, we can see an urban farm, We can see, excellent quality recreational infrastructure in the form of ovals, paths. So it's really a much enriched environment. And the kind of thing that people might actually go, I don't mind living in a studio apartment if I can walk out of it and I have this on my doorstep. It's not just about the park, so it's also about a network of connectivity through the suburbs. So here we're trying to say you'd actually connect the parks to the public transit nodes, here shown in the black dots, to a park, but also to schools and district and neighbourhood kind of urban centres and shops. And the idea here with the streets is that you turn them into something which is halfway between being a street and a linear park. We can see that here where we're actually starting to meander the roadway and opening up usable areas of open space on either side of that, densifying around it. And these kind of networks are particularly good for emerging transport types, which in a post-COVID-19 world are going to be a lot more popular, I would predict. Electric bikes, electric scooters, skateboards, bicycles will all be important ways of getting around. So this provides a different way of moving through the suburbs, and also a kind of ecological matrix too, by which plants and animals can move along these much more heavily, these trees with much heavier tree canopies. Okay, so look, thanks for listening. By conclusion, between 2000 and 2015 around the world, sprawl increased much more than urban population. So basically what's happening around the world is we're sprawling more than we ever have. And I think that's partly because planners have not spent the time to understand what it is about sprawl that people really aspire to and how we could deliver that in a dense urban catchment, like I've indicated in Greenspace Oriented Development. Thanks a lot for listening. There is a book of this title, Greenspace Oriented Development, which has been authored by myself and urban ecologist Christina Ramalho, UWA, and I would recommend you have a look if you'd like to read further. Okay, thank you very much for joining me, and I'll see you for the next lecture.